back to the deliberations of the Citizens Monetary Policy Committee. It's now the committee has to decide what the RBI should do on June 7th. Chairman Pranab Sen, let me start with you, sir. You did say that the Mudra loan increases and the diminishing of rural distress will put more demand into the system. There is also the increased trade deficit because of a strong rupee, maybe, something which I just wanted to highlight to you. But how should the RBI react to all this?
Well, it's not necessarily that the Mudra loan and reduction in rural distress will lead to the desired result, because you can actually get further worsening of the food price and agri prices in general. So one needs to be a little careful. We also have to be mindful of the fact that fixed capital formation has been declining steadily for a while. Now we are, firmly below 30%. And that's something that should be concerning people. This is the time to actually try and consolidate the initiatives that the government has taken to revive demand in the economy. And so if I were the RBI, I would be thinking ahead of the curve. And really, this is the time where I would certainly shift out of the neutral stance and move to accommodative.
Move to accommodative. Okay, that's a strong statement. Samiran, would you go that far?
Well, to my mind, if you look at between April to the June policy, growth data has been softer, inflation data is softer, global economy better from an inflation sense, if not worse. So the challenge really is that how quickly should RBI respond, and from a communication perspective, it should not look like there is a complete turnaround immediately within 2 months from the somewhat markets interpreted hawkish stance in April. So we have put in about a 40% probability, very subjective one, on even a possibility of a rate cut in the June policy.
Okay.
But still a base case seems to be that RBI will wait for some of these one-off factors that we were discussing to play out before taking a firm call on how much easing will be required. Our sense also is that this is one of those times when RBI can use the flexibility that it had talked about earlier, which is that even with a neutral stance, you have two-way flexibility of moving rates. So it's not that necessarily the stance needs to be changed for a particular rate action to happen.
Okay. Yes, RBI did say that neutral could mean cut, hike or pause. Sajid, what do you think the RBI should do?
So I think if, and this is a big if our inflation and growth forecasts pan out, and we're looking at a situation where inflation is on track to hit 4% or a little bit lower by March of 2018, I think that does open up space for a little bit of easing. But I want to focus on a little bit because I think in the early stages of an inflation targeting regime, the loss function for a central bank can be very asymmetric. The loss from cutting rates and missing your target is deemed to be much higher than the loss from inflation undershooting. So as long as that asymmetry continues, and it's justifiable for most central banks, because they need to have more conviction that that inflation expectations are anchored on a sustainable basis. As long as you have that asymmetrical loss function, I think even though you may have a large inflation undershoot, that may only open up space for modest easing. So our own forecast is there's probably space that may open up for 25 basis points of cuts later in the year. In June, I don't think there will be any change in stance that will be deemed to be too impulsive, but I would look for a tonal change, both in terms of the tone the MPC uses, but also on the risk bias of their inflation outlook. I think in the last two meetings, it was very much focused on upside risks. I would look for risks now to be portrayed as being either more balanced or slightly to the downside, assuming the monsoon progresses normally.
Okay, Sonal, your vote on what the RBI should do on June 7th?
I think it's important for the MPC to wait for the conditions to normalize, for growth levels to normalize back from the demonetization shock completely, wait to see where core inflation actually stabilizes. Because even apart from demonetization, the fact is that we have seen a substantial positive supply impulse on the food front. We are seeing pulses deflation. Vegetables are in a deflation, and in the backdrop where rural wages are still growing at 6-7%, minimum support prices still growing at 5-6%, it does appear that a significant part of the very, very benign sort of growth inflation outlook has actually been triggered by demonetization. So, the MPC therefore has to wait for things to stabilize rather than, react basis on data which has been clearly influenced by demonetization, which is going to be transitory. Our view is that the MPC basically stays on the neutral stance, on hold throughout this year. Because, let's not forget, if the momentum in core inflation has particularly declined after demonetization, and again, there are various ways of measuring core inflation. One of the measures we look at closely is the trim mean measure, which clearly shows that the deceleration has happened after demonetization. So if remonetization happens, which it is happening, then we might not see a successive, downward surprise on core inflation. That is one. And second, the impact of GST on inflation is not very clear. Now, from a monetary policy perspective, obviously, the one-time effect does not matter. But looking at the evidence from other countries, our sense is that there will be an asymmetric pricing response. And there is a risk that actually GST could end up being slightly inflationary, despite the government putting in all the efforts to ensure that it is disinflationary. So I think that is still a risk. And the HRA increase is, again, more statistical, but something that will impact headlines. So, keeping all those factors in mind, and also the fact that the reward from, delivering a 25 basis point rate cut for the macroeconomy is not much. Let's be clear on that. And the risk, if inflation does revert back to 5%, by March 2018, which actually is fairly possible, would actually be quite high in terms of the credibility in the very early stages of inflation targeting. So the best course is on course, a wait and watch, on hold.
Soumya, what else should they bring to bear in terms of an action?
See, I think the first thing the MPC after deliberation should do is to give out a statement in terms of the policy, which shows that it is now more dovish in nature. Because if we look into the past trends, the current data, and just one thing I would like to point out, at least two things. The first thing is that there is still a significant amount of liquidity sloshing in the system. If you look into the incremental credit and the incremental deposits, and if you take out the incremental credit from the deposits, still 2.7 lakh crores is there in the system, and add to that another 1 lakh crore which has come in through the 15 billion capital inflows in the last 4 months. So that makes the job of RBI a little bit easier, because if the RBI gives a signal to the market that it's in a mode whereby the price will be dovish, the interest rate will definitely move down. This is first thing. The second thing that the central bank should actually do, it should look at the inflation forecasts a little better. Possibly it could give out some strategy in terms of a short-term and long-term forecast, because every time there's a long-term forecast on inflation, that is difficult to interpret, because the oil prices, nobody has a take on oil prices, how they are government spending, how they are going to behave in the next 12 to 14 months. So maybe a move to some sort of a short-term strategy in terms of inflation forecasting could give the market a better handle on the price expectations and the numbers going forward.
Okay. It's time that our committee members told us what they want the RBI to do. Sajid, let me start with you this time. What do you think the RBI should do?
We're expecting a hold, a pause.
Okay, Sonal, your vote?
Well, we are expecting RBI to stay on hold.
Samiran? Okay, pause, so no action. Soumya also says pause. Dr. Sen, what would you have the committee do? Okay, that's a hold. All right, so that's a hold from all the 5 members of the committee. The next vote is on what do you expect the stance to be? Sajid?
I think it'll be a neutral to dovish tone.
Okay. Neutral to dovish. Sonal, well, even if not stance, what should the tone of the statement be?
monetary policy stance, which was shifted to neutral. That stance we think stays at neutral.
Samiran, yes, this is a softer than April stance, so I would put it as mildly dovish. And, Saumya thinks it should be neutral to downside. So, again, I would interpret both of you on the same side as dovish. Dr. Sen, what would you expect the stance or the tone to be? Accommodative, that's a very strong statement. That is, for a few expecting it to be dovish. In fact, Dr. Sen going to say it should be even accommodative, but Sonal believing it could remain neutral. Thank you very much for watching this special edition of the Citizens Monetary Policy Committee.